Man, what a great video I have for you today. One of the best plugins that helped me in getting better masters is MD3 Powercore version from TC Electronic. I used this plugin for more than 10 years now, and you may notice this. There are tons of new audio plugins that appear on the market every year, but MD3 the Powercore version, even after 10 years, still remains one of the best multi-band compressors that I have in my audio production toolbox. As a side note, I want to mention that I was lucky because the engineer who mixed and mastered my second album back in 2007, just a couple of months before I created my first ever Pro Tools session, actually showed me what he was using when I asked. So if you watch this video, Viorel, thank you for your insights and guidance. Now, why is this important? That is, to have someone who would show you the tools that are worth investing in. When I began my audio production, I started chasing shiny plugins that audio gurus were recommending. And one of the biggest mistakes I made during those times was using a limiter that so many gurus recommend even today. Years later, I understood that sometimes the tools you are using do matter, especially at the mastering stage. And if you want to learn audio mastering, check out my Pro Audio Mastering program, where I go in details about the mastering mindset and the tools you need, the why, and the way you have to use them so that you can finally make your audio production sound professional. In 2007 I created my first Pro Tools session, and in 2009 I composed, produced, mixed and mastered my third album. But as always, I wanted to grow more, especially at the mastering stage. That's when I asked the engineer who mixed and mastered my second album about the tools he was using. And then was my first ever contact with the TC Electronic Powercore platform. I was impressed with the quality of the reverbs and compressors, but there was one main problem: I couldn't afford it. Why? Well, we were still in the process of building our studio, so the main investment at that point was into our studio. After a couple of years and lots of research, in 2011 I actually managed to buy a Powercore which came with some of the best reverbs and mastering audio processors ported from TC Electronic System 6000. By the way, this is one of the best systems used by mastering engineers around the world, but it is also used in audio production and the film industry. And this Powercore was actually a gift I bought for my brother, but I'll tell you the story maybe in another episode. So if you don't want to miss out any future episodes, subscribe to this channel and let's help each other grow. One of the best plugins that was present in the Powercore 6000 was the MD3, which came as a bundle with the brick wall limiter, which by the way is still one of the best brick wall limiters I have ever heard and used in my audio production journey. So, the MD3 Powercore version was ported from TC Electronic System 6000, which hopefully one day I will review. After using the MD3 and being amazed about how it affects any material you send through it, I was searching for different tools mastering engineers use. And one of the famous mastering engineers who I respect was using the MD4 in his System 6000. That's when I started wondering how the MD3 compares with the MD4. And today I'll actually do that. Well, kind of, because I do not have a System 6000 yet. But recently, TC Electronic released the MD4 HD Native, so hopefully I can finally listen to the MD4 processing. In today's video, my aim is to test the MD4 HD Native, but also to compare it with the MD3 Native and the Powercore version, and the video is made up of different sections for a better navigation. Also, you will get a glimpse of how I actually test plugins before I skip or buy them. But before we do that, if you want to improve your mixes and masters in less than 10 minutes, get your free cheat sheet here. And while you do that, I'll play my majestic intro. According to TC Electronic, the MD4 HD Native is an EQ, versatile 5-band compressor and true peak limiter based on the System 6000, which again is one of the best mastering systems on the market. And here we have some more information. So it is a flexible 6-band EQ, a 5-band compressor, which includes soft clipping and a newly true peak limiter. And here you have more information on the system it is based on. If you want to test the plugin for yourself, go to the software section and download it. Also, I encourage you to get the plugins manual for more in-depth information. As I do with all the new plugins that make me curious to find out more about them, the first step will be to actually test or trial the plugin. To get your trial, click here and send a free 14 days trial license to your iLock account. activate the license, and here's how the new MD4 HD Native plugin looks like. I have to say that the new plugin interface from the entire recently launched line of plugins is pretty interesting. Also, I like that they color-coded different sections with the settings that we can customize. So let's make a quick presentation of the plugin. On the left, you notice that we have 4 main sections. The main section, EQ, 5-band, which is the compressor section, and the output. So let's begin with the main section. In this section, you can control the normalizer gain and the volume of the left and right channels individually. Next, while we have a section dedicated to the 5-band compressor, in the main section we can customize some compressor settings. For example, here you can choose how you want MD4 to process audio, and we have 2 options, stereo and mid-side, in case you want to process the mono and the stereo sections individually. If you do want to set the MD4 in mid-side mode, you can see here that the meters are changing from left and right to mid and side. Next, we have a low cut that you can set up to 200 Hz, and according to the manual, it is with increasing step width as the frequency increases. And here you can set the detector crest mode, and you can select between the RMS and peak mode. If you get confused at some point and want more information on some of the settings, you can hover over the setting you want to affect while reading some more info in this section here. For example, in this case we are informed that the peak mode is for transient catching, while the RMS mode is recommended for content leveling. Cool! Now let's move on. In the next section you can choose between different modes the compressor can operate in the MD4. By default, we have the normal mode for the usual downward compression. The parallel mode is for upward compression, the parallel UL is for upward compression but with unlinked channels, that is, the right and left channels in this case will be compressed individually. And then we have the DXP mode, which is a type of compression that you can use for lifting up low levels without touching transients. That's very interesting, and I don't recall to have ever encountered this type of compression so far in the tools I have tested. I'll definitely have to check it out. So depending on what you want to achieve with compression, you have 4 modes that you can choose from here. In the reference level, you can choose the level at which the compressor threshold will start operating. Depending on the material, the lower you will set this reference level, the more the compressor will process your material. TC Electronic recommends to set this level close to the RMS level you are aiming for. So, if you aim for a RMS value of minus 10 dB RMS, set the reference level to minus 10 dB. Next, in the look ahead delay section, you can choose a delay that will help the compressor to look ahead on your material or analyze it and then process it. Usually, longer look ahead values end up in a better and transparent compression. Okay, now let's move to the EQ section. The MD4 lets you choose between 6 EQ bands, low 1, low 2, mid 1, mid 2 and high 1 and high 2. If you click on the EQ link, depending on the mode you are in, you can unlink the left and right channels or the mono or the stereo section so that you can affect them individually. In this case we are in stereo mode, therefore we unlinked the left and right channels. So in this case we can EQ the left and right channels individually. And here you can activate and bypass different EQ bands. If you want to bypass the entire EQ, click here on the on button. Next, at the bottom, if you click on the frequency here, you can see the frequency each band is set to, and the bands are also color-coded as on the top. Next, you can customize the gain and the EQ type. And then you can choose to affect the lows, the mids, or the highs. So when you select these options, in this window here you have access to the values of bands like the frequency, the gain, and the filter type in front of you, which is cool when you want a quicker access. And then we have the 5-band section, where we have more controls that we can customize on the 5-band compressor. And you see here, now he is in the stereo mode, because this is the mode we have set in the main section of the MD4. But if we go back and change the mode to mid-side, now we can compress the mid, also known as the mono section, or the side, also known as the stereo section. And here we can link and unlink the stereo or the mid-side information. So let's set the configuration back to stereo. And here you can affect the overall threshold, ratio, the makeup gain, the attack and release. But heads up, this is a 5-band compressor, so when you set the threshold to -8, that might not mean that all the 5 bands have the threshold set to -8 dB. One band might have -6, another -10 dB and so on, depending on how you set the bands individually. And I'm going to show you where you can set the threshold on individual bands in just a second. Next, we have the wet gain that you can use when the compressor is set in the parallel mode. And then we have the defeat threshold, which is relative to the compressor threshold and which you can use to expand low levels. The defeat ratio can also be used to expand low levels. Now, I told you that if you set the threshold to -8 dBs, that might not necessarily mean that you set this threshold to all the bands. If you want to do that, you can do it here. Consider this as the main threshold of the compressor. So when you lower the main threshold by 1 dB, for example, all the thresholds of the 5 bands will also lower by 1 dB, even if they have different threshold values, and this goes both ways. You should keep this concept in mind also when affecting the ratio, the makeup gain, and the release. So here you affect all the bands even if they have different values, while here you can affect the bands individually. And here we have the bands crossovers. In case you need fewer bands, you can turn off some crossovers by lowering the hertz value until you hit the off option. And here are the meters where you can see how much compression you apply. In case you want to bypass the compressor, you can click the on option as in the EQ section case. And that's it for the compression section. Next, we have the limiter and the soft clipper section. Here we have the limiter gain, and then there are different profiles that you can choose from, like universal, loud, voice, soft, and dynamic. Next, there is the soft clip that you can also bypass in case you don't need it. In case you want to limit the left and right channels individually, click on the limiter link to unlink them. And then we have the output gain plus the compare gain, which is very useful in case you want to hear how MD4 affects the material you're working on by adjusting it to your material loudness or volume. Next, at the bottom, we have this section where you can assign different values that you want to have a quicker access to. To set this up, click on Assign, then on the cell you want to affect, and then choose the setting you want from the main, EQ, 5-band or the output section. Then here you can select different presets. Another feature I like is that you can customize the size of the plugin. And that's pretty much the overview of the MD4 sections and their controls. In the next section of this video, we are going to test how the MD4 actually sounds like. For this test, I'm going to choose a song of mine on which I worked pretty intensive in order to have the 3D space and separation between the elements in the mix. And by the way, if you want to learn how to produce a song from an idea to a finished mastered song, check out my music production masterclass at adrianmilea.com. So for this test, I'll use the MD4 HD along MD3 Native and the MD3 Powercore version. I also matched the plugins with the original unprocessed mix in terms of loudness. So let's take a listen. In this section, we're going to test how the EQ sounds and how it affects the mix. For this part of the test, I set a band frequency to 8 kHz on all the plugins, with a gain of 3 dBs, of course, only for testing purposes. So let's listen first how the EQ on the MD4 sounds like on this mix. So far, I like how the EQ opens up the mix. It is not harsh and it affects the mix in a clean way. Now let's test the EQ on the MD3 Native with the exact same settings as in the MD4 and see if they sound similar. To my ears, both EQs sound similar, but to test things further, let's see if these bands cancel out. To make this null test possible, I'm going to activate the antiphase. So we have some low information in the low area, but that might be caused by another section in MD3 or MD4. However, from this test we can see and hear that the 8 kHz area does cancel out, which makes me think that the EQ in MD4 might be the same as in the MD3 native. Now, I would like to compare how the same area sounds in MD3, the Powercore version. Again, I use the same frequency, gain and EQ type in both plugins, so let's listen. To me, the EQ in the Powercore sounds less transparent than in the native plugins, but let's actually compare them side by side. So yeah, from this test I like the EQ in the MD4 better, because it seems to me to be more transparent and cleaner than the one in MD3 Powercore. In case you wonder if they null, they don't, while they do have the same frequency, gain and EQ type. However, the MD4 and MD3 native null. Now, let's repeat the experiment but with a shelf at 10 kHz and let's add 5 dB of gain, and that's only for testing purposes. Again, I like how the EQ opens up the mix in a very transparent way. Now, let's see if MD3 native sounds the same. And again, it seems that it does sound like the MD4. But how the Powercore version sounds this time? It seems to me that the EQ in the Powercore version takes out some of the mix transparency. Let's compare it again with the MD4. And again, I like the EQ in MD4 more in this particular case. I like how it opens up the mix, and I like its transparency, while I like less the EQ in the Powercore version. But to be honest, I almost never used the EQ in the MD3 the Powercore version, because after years of use, I believe this multiband processor actually shines in the compression area. Now we have one more thing to test, and that is if the high shelves of the MD3 native and MD4 cancel out. And from my tests, they do null. So this might mean that MD3 native and MD4 have the same EQ, but MD4 has 2 more EQ bands that you can customize. I'm not 100% of this because there is still some low information that I have to figure out as to why is it there. Maybe another time. And from the MD4 and the MD3 Powercore null tests, you can see that they don't null, so this might mean that they have different EQs. Anyway, for now, from these tests I have two main conclusions. First, I like the EQ section in the MD3 Native and MD4 HD Native more than the EQ in the MD3 Powercore version. Also, the EQ section in the MD3 Native and MD4 might be the same but with different number of available bands. Okay, so this is it for the EQ section. Now comes the part that I'm really interested in, and that is the compression part. So in this section of the video, we're going to actually test how these plugins affect the mix with their compression sections. To give you some context, I bypassed the EQs on the plugins and I set the same values for ratio, attack and release on all of their bands. I also tried to compress at least 1 dB in the low range to hear how the compressors affect the mix. What I want from this test is to find out which plugin compresses the mix in the most transparent way without affecting its 3D space and the separation of the elements in the mix. So first, let's listen to the MD4 compressor. I have to say that I'm impressed so far. Still, it seems to me that MD4 tightens the stereo image and the depth of the mix a bit, and it also takes out a bit of the separation between the elements of the mix. Now, let's listen to the MD3 Native. Okay, so what I hear in this case is what I hear in the majority of compressor plugins that are on the audio market. After processing, a lot of 3D space, depth and separation and transparency is lost. Now let's listen to how the MD3 Powercore affects this part of the mix. As I know how the compressor in the MD3 Powercore version affects audio in general, I didn't expect anything but transparent compression. The 3D space, the stereo image and the separation between the elements of the mix stay almost untouched. And while we compress more than 1 dB in the low range, the freedom of the mix, if you want, that I worked for at the mixing stage is still there. Now, the next obvious test would be to actually test the MD3 Powercore version against the MD4. So let's select another part of the mix and take a listen. As this is a song of mine which I produced and mixed, I heard parts of it hundreds and hundreds of times while producing it and mixing it. And as I mentioned, I tried to bring 3D space and separation between the elements of the mix as much as possible. So what I'm trying to say is that I know how this mix should sound. And from this test, I feel that MD4 tightens the stereo image and the mix overall. There's some separation that is lost, but it is hard to notice this. Overall, after this particular test, I can say that the mix breathes more while being processed by the MD3 Powercore version. It is also compressed in a more transparent way by the compressor in the MD3 Powercore version. Still, it is worth mentioning that the MD4 compressor is a really good compressor. And with this, I will end this section of this video. Now, before we continue, I would like to thank all of you who watch these videos because I make them for you and other audio producers who, like me, are always upgrading their skills. And in case you didn't subscribe yet to my channel, please do it. In this way, you will make it possible for me to make more videos like this. So, let's actually help each other and grow together. Thank you. In 2011, I started using the MD3 Powercore into my audio production, and I continued to learn how to get better and better at my craft, while searching for new tools that mastering engineers use. That's when I found out about the MD4 processor in the System 6000 from TC Electronic. And a couple of years ago, I found out that a mastering engineer who I respect a lot and from whom I learned and continue to learn indirectly mentioned that a certain native plugin has the most transparent parallel compression, which could be the first and the only replacement for an external processor he owns. That got me interested. Then after watching a cool audio engineer on YouTube, I discovered the DynOne from Leapwing Audio. So more than 2 years ago, I bought the DynOne. I was really impressed by the quality of this plugin, and so far this was the only plugin I used for parallel compression in my mastering sessions. The next day I bought DynOne. I sent an email to Leapwing Audio team to find more about the external processor I read about in that DynOne review, and they got back to me. The mentioned processor was the System 6000 from TC Electronic. So, after more than 2 years of using DynOne for parallel compression, today I'm going to compare it with the recently launched MD4 HD Native. Why? Because one of the compression modes in the MD4 HD Native is the parallel compression. So, for this test, I tried to adjust the settings as close as possible. I set the same RMS detection mode, the same 2.5:1 ratio, but the tricky part is that the attack and release on DynOne have two different values, a minimum attack and release and a maximum attack and release. In this way, you let the algorithm choose what's the best attack or release depending on the material you're working on. So I set them closer to the values I set on the MD4. And I also set the same crossovers. So let's listen to how the two processors inject parallel compression into the mix. Okay, I honestly didn't expect to hear a big difference between the two, but obviously TC Electronic injected some magic into MD4 that makes me like the MD4 parallel compression more. Let's listen to another section. Okay, so far I like the MD4 parallel compression better because it keeps the transparency and the clarity of the mix while injecting some awesomeness into the mix. I remember I got almost the same feeling when I first tested DynOne more than 2 years ago. That tells me that the audio plugins technology in the native world is evolving, which is a very good thing. Now, I want to test DynOne and the MD4 in normal downward compression mode. So I set the compressor in the MD4 to normal mode, kept the other settings the same, and I deactivated the parallel mode on DynOne. Okay, so overall I feel that MD4 again preserves the sound of the mix while compressing it, in a clean and transparent way, while DynOne does affect the mix, but not in the direction I want it to. Personally, I really hope there will be an update on the DynOne sometime soon. So far in this video we tested the EQ in the MD4, the compression and the parallel compression. Now it's time to test the so-called DXP mode. And if you remember, you can use the DXP compression mode when you want to lift levels without touching transients. For this test, I'm going to compare the unprocessed mix with the processed version. So let's listen to how this type of compression affects the mix. So it seems to me that the DXP mode brings more details in front of the mix while making it more present. Let's listen to another section. Okay, so obviously in this case there's too much DXP compression, at least I believe it is, but I like this type of compression and I would use it in softer material but also on electronic stuff. It is interesting how this mode makes the mix more present. At one point I thought that I left the EQ section on, but it was not. So overall, I like how this mode brings details in front of the mix. Before we move on, I have to mention that when you select the DXP compression mode, you can make more adjustments with the so-called steer option. So you can affect the mix the way you like and need it. And we finished another important section of this video. If you like what you saw so far, take a second and hit that subscribe button, and then let's move on. That's it for the compression section. In the next section of this video, we're going to test the limiters in these plugins. I set the limiter threshold to -1 dB, the soft clip to -6 dB on all of them, and then I adjusted the gain so that they could match in terms of loudness as much as possible. And I want to test mainly the MD4 versus the MD3 Powercore version. So let's listen. Okay, so the limiters sound to me pretty decent. In fact, I would say that they sound better than many limiters out there. However, I will point out that there's a small difference in how the two plugins affect the mix. I still feel that the MD3 from Powercore lets more freedom to the mix and it keeps more 3D space, depth and separation than the MD4. But the difference is really small as they both sound pretty good. And before we end this video, I also wanted to see how these limiters handle the true peaks at -1 dB threshold. For this test, I aimed for a -10 LUFS loudness, so we could say that this loudness is on the hotter side. So first in line is the MD3 Powercore, which you can see that even if I set the threshold to -1 dB, the true peaks reach 1 dB full scale. The MD4 reaches 0.5 dBs. And in the MD3 native case, even if I select the true peak mode, the true peaks reach 0.3 dBs full scale. So my guess is, if you would aim for a -14 LUFS loudness for your production, you may be okay in terms of true peaks, but of course, you should still keep an eye on your true peak analyzer. In my case, I never use the limiter on the MD3 Powercore version. I use instead the brick wall limiter from the bundle, which is one of the best and transparent limiters I have worked with. And that's it for the limiter section. And there you have it. This was a glimpse of how I tested the newly launched MD4 multiband processor from TC Electronic. And before we go to the conclusions part, if you're interested in audio mastering, check out my Pro Audio Mastering program, where I go in depth and present step by step how to make your audio production sound professional. And if you do enroll, I want to thank you in advance for your support. So what are my conclusions? You already saw some conclusions during the video, but I'm going to present some of them once more in this section. From my tests, I still like more the compression section in the MD3 Powercore version. It feels to me that it is one of the most transparent compression I can apply to different types of mixes. However, MD4 is almost there, and sometimes in blind tests it can be hard to distinguish the difference between the compressors in the two plugins. Plus, MD4 has different compression modes like the parallel compression, which I discovered that I like better than in DynOne. Also, MD4 has the DXP mode, which can help you bring in front more details depending on your material. Plus, it is worth mentioning that MD4 has one of the best EQs that I have ever heard, and in my opinion, it is better than the EQ in the MD3 Powercore version. The bottom line is, if I would not have the MD3 from Powercore and DynOne, I would definitely go with MD4 HD Native. In terms of limiting, I would not use the MD4 limiter on very hot levels, but depending on your toolbox, you may discover that the limiter in MD4 is better, so it's up to you to experiment. In the end, at this point in my audio production journey, in my honest opinion, MD4 HD Native from TC Electronic is one of the best multiband processors that I have ever tried or worked with. If you're in search for a multiband compressor and a great sounding EQ, the MD4 HD Native is a no-brainer investment, exactly as my Pro Audio Mastering program. So there you have it. This is my review on the new MD4 HD Native from TC Electronic. I hope this video will help you in your quest for better sounding audio plugins and tools. So if you liked the video, subscribe, give a thumbs up and share it with the ones who may need it. If you have any questions, comment below, and until next time, stay cool and make great music.